Hi everyone, and welcome back to another session of me reading The Hobbit by JRR Tolkien. Now, as you can see, I've actually had an opportunity to come back to my own library for the last two chapters of The Hobbit. I was looking, and there are about 15 pages between the last two chapters, so I'm going to try my very hardest to get through chapters 18 and 19 in this section, just because the last two are pretty short. And the one right before it was really short too, but I couldn't really combine them. So, if you guys remember, there was the Battle of the Five Armies, and the eagles were coming just as Bilbo had something crash on his head, and then he kind of blacked out. So we don't know what's happening here. But chapter 18 is called The Return Journey. So, if you can imagine, things are looking up for our friends. So I'm going to start there. When Bilbo came to himself, he was literally by himself. He was lying in the flat stones of Ravenhill, and no one was near. It was a cloudless day, but cold, and it was broad above him. He was shaking and was chilled as a stone. But his head burned with fire. Now I wonder what had happened, he said to himself. At any rate, I am not yet one of the fallen heroes, but I suppose there's still time for that. He sat up painfully, looking into the valley. He could see no living goblins. After a while, his head cleared a little, and he thought he could see the elves moving in the rocks below. He rubbed his eyes. Surely there was a camp still in the plains some distance off, and there was a coming and going about the gate. Dwarves seemed busy removing the wall, but all was deadly still. There was no call and no echo of a song. Sorrow seemed to be in the air. Victory after all, I suppose, he said, feeling his aching head. Well, it seems to be a very gloomy business. Suddenly he was aware of a man climbing up and coming towards him. Hello there, he called with a shaky voice. Hello there, what is the news? What happened? What voice is that speaks among the stones? Said the man, halting and peering about from him, not far from where Bilbo sat. Then Bilbo remembered his ring. Well, I'm blessed, he said. This invisibility has drawn back after all. Otherwise, I suppose I might have spent a warm, comfortable night in bed. It's me, Bilbo Baggins, companion of Thorin, he cried, hurriedly taking off his ring. It is well that I have found you, said the man, striding forward. You are needed, and I have been looking for you long. You would have been numbered among the dead, who are many, if Gandalf the Wizard had not said that your voice was heard in this place. I have been sent here to look for you one last time. Are you much hurt? A nasty knock on the head, I think, said Bilbo. But I have a helm and a hard skull. All the same, I feel sick and my legs are like straw. I will carry you down to the camp in the valley, said the man, and he picked him up lightly. The man was swift and sure-footed. It was not long before Bilbo was set down before a tent in Dale, and there stood Gandalf with his arm in a sling. Even the wizard had not escaped without a wound, and there were few unharmed in its host. When Gandalf saw Bilbo, he was delighted. Baggins, he exclaimed. Well, I never. Alive after all, and I am glad. I began to wonder if your luck would have seen you through it. A terrible business, and it nearly was disastrous. But other news can wait. Come, he said more gravely. You are called for. And leading the Hobbit, he took them within the tent. Now, if you guys remember from the last time, Thorin wasn't so happy with Bilbo because he gave the enemies the Arkenstone, so that still needs to get settled. Hail Thorin, he said as he entered. I have brought him. Indeed, there lay Thorin Oakenshield, wounded with many wounds, and his rent armor and notched axe were cast upon the floor. He looked up at Bilbo as he came beside him. Farewell, good thief, he said. I go now to the halls of the waiting to sit beside my fathers, until the world is renewed. Since I leave now all the gold and silver, and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part with friendship with you, and I would take back my words and the deeds that I said at the gate. Bilbo knelt his knee with sorrow. Farewell, King under the mountain, he said. This is a bitter adventure, if it must end so, and not a mountain of gold can amend it. Yet I am glad to have shared in your perils. That has been more than any Baggins deserves. No, said Thorin. There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food or cheer or song above hoarding gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave now. Farewell. Then Bilbo turned away, and he went by himself and sat alone, wrapped in a blanket, and whether you believe it or not, he wept until his eyes were red and his voice was hoarse. He was a kindly soul. Indeed, it was long before he had the heart to make a joke again. A mercy it is, he said at last, that I woke up when I did. I wish Thorin were living, but I'm glad that we parted in kindness. You are a fool, Bilbo Baggins, and you made a great mess of that business with the stone, and there was a battle, in spite of all your efforts to buy peace and quiet, but I suppose you can hardly be blamed for that. All that had happened after he was stunned, Bilbo learned later, but it gave him more sorrow than joy, and he was now weary of this adventure. He was aching in his bones for the homeward journey. That, however, was a little delayed. In the meantime, I will tell you some of the events. The eagles had long had suspicions of the goblins mustering, from their watchfulness movements in the mountains, could not be altogether hid. So they too had gathered in great numbers under the great eagle of the misty mountains, and at length, smelling battle from afar, they came speeding down the gale in the nick of time. They it was who dislodged the goblins from the mountain slopes, casting them over precipices, or driving them down shrieking and bewildered among their foes. It was not long before they had freed the lonely mountain, and the elves and the men on either side of the valley could come at last to help the battle below. But even with the eagles, they were still outnumbered. In that, the last hour, Beorn himself appeared. No one knew how or from where, but he came alone and in bear's shape, and he seemed to have grown to almost a giant size in his wrath. The roar of his voice was like drums and guns, and he tossed the wolves and the goblins from their path like straw and feathers. He fell upon the rear and broke like a clap of thunder through the ring. The dwarves were still making a stand about their lords upon a low rounded hill. Then Beorn stood and lifted Thorin, who had fallen, pierced with spears, and bore him out of the fray. Swiftly he returned, and his wrath was redoubled, so that nothing could withstand him. No weapon seemed to bite upon him. He scattered the bodyguard, and pulled down Bolg himself and crushed him. Then dismay fell upon the goblins, and they fled in all directions. But weariness left their enemies with the coming of new hope, and they pursued them closely, and prevented most of them from escaping where they could. They drove many of them into the running river, and such fled south or west as they hunted into the marshes about the forest river. And there the greater part of the last fugitives perished, while those who came hardly to the wood elves' realm were there slain, or drawn to die deep in the trackless dark of Mirkwood. Songs have been said that 3 parts of the goblin warriors of the north perished that day, and the mountain had had peace for many a year. Victory had been assured before the fall of night, but the pursuit was still on foot when Bilbo returned to the camp, and not many were in the valley, save for the grievously wounded. "Where are the eagles?" he asked Gandalf that evening as he lay wrapped in so many warm blankets. "Some are in the hunt," said the wizard, "but most have gone back to their eyries. They would not stay here, and departed with first light in the morning. Dane had crowned their chief with gold, and sworn friendship for them forever." "I'm sorry. I should have liked to see them again," said Bilbo sleepily. "Perhaps I shall see them on the way home. I suppose I should be going home soon?" "As soon as you like," said the wizard. Actually, it was some days before Bilbo really set out. They buried Thorin deep beneath the mountain, and Bard laid the Arkenstone upon his breast. "There let it lie till the mountain falls," he said. "May it bring good fortune to all of his folk who dwell here." Upon his tomb the elven king laid Orcrist, the elvish sword that had been taken from Thorin in his captivity. It is said that in songs that it gleamed forever in the dark if foes approached, and the fortress of the dwarves could not be taken by surprise. There now Dane, son of Nain, took up his abode, and he became king under the mountain, and in time many of the other dwarves gathered to his throne in the ancient halls. Of the 12 companions of Thorin, 10 remained. Fili and Kili had fallen defending him with shield and body, for he was their mother's eldest brother. The other remained with Dane, for Dane dealt with the treasure as well. Now, I just want to stop there for a second, because you guys may not understand this, but Kili and Fili were cousins to Thorin, and they were actually the last of Thorin's line, which was called the line of Durin. So after that, it would have passed on to Dane, because he came to the aid of the dwarves, but Thorin's line ended there. So just like how they reigned with kings back in olden days and things like that, That's why Dane took it over, is because there was nobody left in Thorin's line to be able to take his place. There was, of course, no longer any question of dividing the hoard in such shares as had been planned. To Balin and Dwalin, and Dori and Nori and Ori, and Oin and Gloin, and Bifur and Boffer and Bomber, or to Bilbo. Yet a 14th share of all the silver and gold, wrought and unwrought, was given up to Bard. For Dane said, "We will honor the agreement of the dead," and he now has the Arkenstone to his keeping. Even a 14th share was wealth exceedingly great, greater than all of many mortal kings. For that treasure, Bard sent much gold to the master of Lake Town, and he rewarded his followers and his friends freely. To the Elven king he gave the emeralds of Giroin, such as jewels that he loved most, which Dane had restored to him. To Bilbo he said, "This treasure is much as yours as it is mine, though the old arguments cannot stand, since many have claimed in its winning and defense. Yet, even though you were willing to lay aside all your claim, I should wish that the words of Thorin, of which he repented, should not prove true, and that we should give you little. I would reward you most richly of all." "That's very kind of you," said Bilbo, "but really it is a relief to me. How on earth should I get all that treasure home without the war and murder along the way? I don't know. And I don't know what I should have done with it when I got home. I am sure that it is better in your hands." In the end, he would only take 2 small chests, one filled with silver, the other with gold, such as one strong pony could carry. "That will be as much as I could manage," he said. At last the time came for him to say goodbye to his friends. "Farewell, Balin," he said, "and farewell, Dwalin, and farewell, Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, Gloin, Bifur, Bofur, and Bomber. May your beards never grow thin," he said, turning towards the mountain. He added, farewell, Thorn Oakenshield, and Fili and Kili, may your memories never fade." Then the dwarves bowed low before their gate, but words were stuck in their throat. "Goodbye and good luck wherever you fare," said Balin at last. "If you ever visit us again, when our halls are made fair once more, then the feast shall indeed be splendid." "If you are ever passing my way," said Bilbo, "don't wait to knock. Tea is at 4, but you are welcome at any time." Then he turned away. The elf host was on the march, and it was sadly lessened, yet many were glad, for now the northern world would be merrier for a long day. The dragon was dead and the goblins overthrown, and their hearts looked forward to a spring of joy. Gandalf and Bilbo rode behind the Elven King, and beside them strode Beorn, once again in a man's shape, and he laughed and sang in a loud voice upon the road. So they went on until they drew near the borders of Mirkwood, to the north of the place where the forest river ran out. They halted then, for the wizard and Bilbo could not enter these woods, even though the king bade them to stay a while in his halls. They intended to go along the edge of the forest and round its northern edge in the wastes that lay between it and between the grey mountains. It was a long, cheerless road, but for now the goblins were crushed, and it seemed safer to them than the dreadful pathways under the trees. Moreover, Beorn was going that way too. "Farewell, O Elven King," said Gandalf. "Merry be the greenwood, while the world is still yet young, and merry be all of your folk." "Farewell, O Gandalf," said the king. "May you ever appear when you are most needed and least expected. The oftener you appear in my halls, the better I shall be pleased." "I beg of you," said Bilbo, stammering and standing in one foot, "to accept this gift," and he brought out a necklace of silver and pearls that Dane had given to him in parting. "In what way have I earned this such a gift, O Hobbit?" said the king. "Well, I don't know," said Bilbo, rather confused, "that, some little return should be made for your hospitality? I mean, even a burglar has feelings. I have drunk much of your wine and eaten much of your bread." "I will take your gift, O Bilbo the Magnificent," the king said gravely, "and I name you elf friend and blessed. May your shadow never grow less, or stealing would be too easy. Farewell." Then the elves turned towards the forest, and Bilbo started on his long way home. He had many hardships in his adventures before he got back. The wild was still wild, and there were many other things in those days besides goblins, but he was well guided and well guarded. The wizard was with him, and Beorn for much of the way, and he would never be in great danger again. Anyway, by midwinter, Gandalf and Bilbo had come all the way back along both the edges of the forest to the doors of Beorn's house, and there they stayed for a while. Yuletide was warm and merry there, and the men came from far and wide to feast at Beorn's bidding, and hidden in the deepest holes that they could find. And the wargs had vanished from I missed a part. The goblins of the Misty Mountains were now few and terrified, and hidden in the deep holes that they could find. And the wargs had vanished from the wood, so that men went abroad without fear. Beorn, indeed, became a great chief afterwards in those regions, and ruled a wide land between the mountains and the woods, and it is said for very many generations of men of his line had the power of taking the shape of a bear, and some were grim men and bad, but most were in their heart like Beorn, if less size and strength. In their day, the last goblins were hunted from the Misty Mountains, and a new peace came over the edge of the wild. It was spring, and a fair one, with mild weather and bright sun, before Bilbo and Gandalf took their leave at last of Beorn, as he longed for home. Bilbo left with regret, for the flowers of the gardens of Beorn were in springtime no less marvelous than in high summer. At last they came upon the long road, and reached the very pass where the goblins had captured them before. But they came to that high point at morning, and looking backwards they saw a white sun shining over the outstretched lands, and there lay Mirkwood, blue in the distance and darkly green, and nearer the edge even in the spring. There, far away, was the lonely mountain on the edge of the eyesight. On its highest peak, snow yet unmelted was gleaming pale. So comes snow after fire. Even dragons have their endings, said Bilbo. He turned his back on his adventure. The Tookish part of him was getting very tired, and the Baggins was daily getting stronger. I now only wish to be in my armchair, he said. All right, so this is the last chapter. This is called The Last Stage, chapter 19, and I think we have just enough time to finish it. It was on May the 1st that the two came back at last to the brink of the house of Rivendell, where stood the last, or first, homely house. Again it was evening, and their ponies were tired, especially the one that carried the baggage, and they all felt need of rest. As they rode down the steep path, Bilbo heard the elves still singing in the tree, as if they had not stopped since he left, and soon the riders came down into the lower glades of the woods. They burst into song of much of the same kind as before, and it went something like this. The dragon is withered, his bones are now crumbled, his armor is shivered, his splendor is humbled. Through sword shall be rusted, and throne and crown perish, the strength of that men trusted, and wealth that they cherished. Here grass is still growing, and leaves are still swinging, the white water flowing, and the elves come singing. Come, tra-la-la, come back to the valley. The stars are far brighter, the gems without measure. The moon is far wider than silver and treasure. The fire is more shining on a hearth of the gloaming than the gold won by mining. Oh, why go a-roaming? Oh, tra-la-la-lolly, come back to the valley. Oh, where are you going so late in returning? The river is flowing and the stars are all burning. Oh, whither so laden, so sad and so dreary? Here elf and elf maiden now welcome the weary. With tra-la-la-lally, come back to the valley. Tra-la-la-lally, tra-la-la-lally, fa-la. Then the elves of the valley came out and greeted them, and led them across the water to the house of Elrond. There was a warm welcome was made for them, and there were many eager ears that evening to hear the tale of their adventure. Gandalf it was who spoke, for Bilbo had fallen quite quiet and drowsy. Most of the tale he knew, for he had been in it, and he himself had told much to the wizard on their homeward way in the house of Beorn. But every now and again he would open one eye and listen, and that part of the story which he did not know yet came in. It was on this way that he learned where Gandalf had been to, for he overheard the words of the wizard to Elrond, and it appeared that Gandalf had been to a great council of the White Wizards, masters of lore and good magic, and that they had last driven the necromancer from his dark hole in the south of Mirkwood. And I said this at one point, but the necromancer is supposed to be Sauron. So if you've read Lord of the Rings, you know what I'm talking about. Ere long ago, Gandalf was saying, the forest will grow somewhat more wholesome. The north will be freed from the horrors for many long years, I hope. Yet I wished he were banished from the world altogether. It would be well indeed, said Elrond, but I fear that will not come about in this age of the world, nor for many after it. When the tale of their journeying was long told, there were other tales, and yet more tales, tales of long ago, and tales of new things, and tales of no time at all, until Bilbo's head fell forward on his chest, and he snored comfortably in a corner. He woke to find himself in a white bed, and the moon shining through a clear open window. Below it many elves were singing, loud and clear on the banks of the stream. Sing all ye joyful now, sing all together, the winds in the treetop, the winds in the heather. The stars are in blossom, the moon is in flower, and bright are the windows of night in her tower. Dance all ye joyful, now dance all together. Soft is the grass, let the foot be like a feather. The river is silver, the shadows are fleeting. Merry is Maytime, and merry our meeting. Sing we now softly, in dreams let us weave him. Wind him in slumber, and there let us leave him. The wanderer sleepeth, now soft be his pillow. Lullaby, lullaby, adder and willow. Sigh no more pine, till the wind of the morn. Fall moon, dark be the land. Hush, hush, oak, ash, thorn. Hush, be all water, till dawn is at hand. Well, merry people, said Bilbo, looking out, what time by the moon is it? Your lullaby would have waken a drunken goblin, yet I thank you. And your snores would have wakened a stone dragon, yet we thank you, they answered with laughter. It is drawing towards dawn, and you have slept now since night's beginning. Tomorrow perhaps you will be cured of weariness. A little sleep does a great cure in the house of Elrond, said he, but it will take all the cure I can get. A second good night, fair friends. And with that he went back to bed and slept until late morning. Weariness fell from him soon after in that house, and he had many a merry jest and dance, early and late, with the elves of the valley. Yet even in that place he could not long delay now, for he always thought of his own home. After a week, therefore, he said farewell to Elrond, and giving him such small gifts as he would accept, he rode away with Gandalf. Merry is Maytime, said Bilbo, as the rain beat into his face, but our back it is to legends as we are coming home. I suppose this is the first taste of it yet. There is a long road yet, said Bilbo. But it is the last road, said Bilbo. They came to the river that marked the very edge of the borderlands of the wild, and to the ford beyond the steep bank, which you may remember. The water was swollen both with the melting of the snows and the approaching summer, and with the day-long rain, but they crossed it with some difficulty and pressed forward, as evening fell, on the last stage of their journey. This was much as it had been before, except that the company was smaller and more silent. Also this time there were no trolls. At each point of the road, Bilbo recalled the happenings of the world it was a year ago. It seemed to him more like 10 years, so that, of course, he quickly noted the place where the pony had fallen into the river, and they had turned aside from their nasty adventures of Tom, Bert, and Bill. Those were the trolls, if you guys remember from a while back. Not far from the road, they had found the trolls, which they had buried, still hidden and untouched. I've had enough to last me a lifetime, Bilbo said when they had dug it up. You had better take this, Gandalf. I dare say you can find a use from it. Indeed I can, said the wizard, but share and share alike. You may find you have more needs than you expect. So if you guys remember, back when they fought the trolls, they went until the troll horde, and they actually found a whole bunch of gold, and they buried it, thinking, I don't know if we'll ever come back. So Bilbo has even more gold now. So they put the gold in the bags and slung them on their ponies, who were not at all pleased about it. After their goings was slower, and for most of the time they walked. But the land was green, and there was much grass for which the hobbit strolled along contently. He mopped his face with a red silk handkerchief. No, not a single one of his own had survived. He had borrowed this one from Elrond, for now June had brought summer, and the weather was bright and hot again. As all things come to an end, even in this story, a day came at last when they were in sight of the country where Bilbo had been born and bred, and where the shapes of the land of his trees were well known to him as his hands and his toes. Coming to a rise, he could suddenly see his own hill in the distance, and he suddenly stopped and said, The roads go ever on and on, over rock and under tree, by caves where the sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea, over snow by winter sown, and through the merry flowers of June, over grass and over stone, and under the mountains and the moon. Roads go ever on, ever on, under cloud and under star. Yet feet that wandering have gone, turn to last at home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horror in the hall of stone, look at last on meadows green, and trees and hills as they long have known. Gandalf looked at him. My dear Bilbo, something is the matter with you. You are not the hobbit that ye once were. They crossed the bridge and passed the mill and river, and came right back to where Bilbo's own door. Bless me, what's going on? He cried. There was a great commotion of people of all sorts, respectable and unrespectable, were thick round his door, and many were going in and out, not even wiping their feet on the mat, as Bilbo noticed with annoyance. If he was surprised, they were more surprised still. He had arrived back in the middle of an auction. There was a large notice in black and red hung on the gate stating that on June the 22nd, Messrs. Grubb, and Burrows would sell by auction the effects of the late Bilbo Baggins, Esquire, of Bag End, Underhill, Hobbiton. Sale to commence at 10 o'clock sharp. It was now already lunchtime, and most of the things had already been sold for various prices, next to nothing to old songs, as it is not unusual at auction. Bilbo's cousins, the Sackville Bagginses, were in fact busy measuring his rooms to see if their old furniture would fit in there. In short, Bilbo was presumed dead, and not everyone said that was so sorry to find the presumption wrong. The return of Mr. Bilbo Baggins created quite the disturbance, both under the hill and over the hill, and across the water. It was a great deal more than a 9 days' wonder. The legal bother, indeed, lasted for years. It was quite a long time before Mr. Baggins was in fact admitted to be alive again. The people who had gotten especially good bargains at the sale took a deal of convincing, and in the end, to save time, Bilbo had to buy back a lot of his own furniture. Many of his silver spoons mysteriously disappeared and were never accounted for. Personally, he suspected the Sackville Bagginses. On their side, they never admitted that the return of Baggins was genuine, and they were not on friendly terms with Bilbo much after that. They really had wanted to live in his nice hobbit hole so very much. Indeed, Bilbo had found that he had lost more than spoons. He had lost his reputation. It is true that forever when he remained an elf friend, he had the honor of dwarves, wizards, and all such folk that ever passed this way. But he was no longer quite respectable as a hobbit. In fact, held by all hobbits of the neighborhood to be very queer, except by his nephews and nieces on the Took side. But even they were not encouraged friendship by their elders. I am sorry to say that he did not mind. He was quite content, and the sound of the kettle on his hearth was ever more musical than it had ever been in the quiet days before the unexpected party. His sword he hung on the wall over the mantelpiece. His coat of mail was arranged on a stand in the hall, until he lent it to a museum. His gold and silver was largely spent in presents, both useful and extravagant, to which a certain extent amounts to the great affection of his nieces and nephews. His magic ring he kept a great secret, for he chiefly used it when unpleasant callers came. He took to writing poetry and visiting the elves, and though many of them shook their head and touched their foreheads and said, "Poor old Baggins," and thought he believed any of his tales, he remained very happy in the end of his days, and those were extraordinarily long. One autumn evening, some years afterwards, Bilbo was sitting in his study writing his memoirs. He thought of calling them There and Back Again, a Hobbit's Holiday, when there was a ring at the door. It was Gandalf and a dwarf, and the dwarf was actually Balin. Come in, said Bilbo, and soon they were settled by the fire. If Balin noticed that Mr. Baggins' waistcoat was more expensive, and that he had real gold buttons, Bilbo also noticed that Balin's beard was several inches longer, and his jeweled belt was of great magnificence. They fell into talking of their times together, of course, and Bilbo asked how things were going in the lands of the mountain. It seemed they were going very well. Bard had rebuilt the town of Dale, and men had gathered from the lake, from the west and the south, and all the valley had become tilled and again rich, and the desolation was now filled with the birds and blossoms of spring, and fruit and feasting in autumn. And Lake Town was refounded and more prosperous than ever, and much wealth went up and down the running river. And there was a friendship in those parts between the elves and the dwarves and the men. The old master had come to a bad end. Bard had given him much gold for the heap of the lake people, but being the kind that easily catches such diseases, he fell under the dragon sickness, and took most of the gold and fled with it, and died of starvation in the waste, deserted by his companions. The new master is wiser, of course, said Balin, and very popular, for, of course, he gets most of the credit for the present prosperity, and they are making songs which say that in his day the river runs with gold. Then the prophecy of old songs have turned out to be true after a fashion, said Bilbo. Of course, said Gandalf, and why should they not prove true? Surely you don't believe in the prophecies, because you had a hand in bringing them about yourself. You don't really suppose, do you, that all your adventures and escapes were by mere luck, just for your sole benefit? You are a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I am very fond of you, but you are only quite a little fellow in a wide world after all. Thank goodness, Bilbo said, laughing, as he handed him the tobacco jar. All right, I got a quick picture to show you. There's supposed to be the inside of Mr. Baggins' hobbit hole. All right, I have just made it to a half an hour, so we made it to the very end. Whew. It's been a long 2 months, but it has been so wonderful reading this to you guys. I wish so much that this had been at school instead of in my home. I loved having you guys here, being able to do fun things and seeing a little bit glimpse into my life. But I miss seeing you guys every day, and Mrs. Whitehead and I just hope so much that we'll be able to resume school in the fall just as we did when we left. I'm sure that they'll like this return journey that Bilbo is going on, and it will be sad because we'll have missed a lot of people, but it'll be joyous in our rejoicing. So thank you so much for joining me on this journey there and back again for The Hobbit. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you later.